Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for getting up a little early on this beautiful Wednesday morning here in Atlanta and joining us. This is a Poultry Future event. We're having a panel discussion on what's next for salmonella control in broilers and turkeys. And I'd like to thank our sponsors. We wouldn't be able to do it without them. I want to thank Ancera, Boehringer Ingelheim, the Poultry Federation, and Zoetis for sponsoring our get-together today. I'd like to introduce our panelists to you. Too many things to hold. Need another hand. Okay, directly to my right is Dr. Elizabeth Krushinskie. She's a veterinarian and also has a PhD in veterinary microbiology. She currently provides consulting services for several animal health and nutrition companies in poultry health and foodborne disease control. And she's been doing this with her own company for the last 6 years. Prior to this, she held director positions in technical service and quality assurance for a few broiler integrators over a number of years. And to her right is Arjun Ganesan. He's the CEO of Ancera. He is the owner and founder of the company, and his mission is to revolutionize the productivity and safety of the U.S. supply chain. Not that he's got big goals or anything, but I wish him great luck in that pursuit. And to his right is Dr. Bill Potter. Bill recently joined the faculty at the University of Arkansas Poultry Science Department, where he's an extension specialist and also the Poultry Federation chair. Bill has extensive experience working with poultry integrators and Elanco throughout the years, and he holds a PhD in poultry science. And to Bill's right is Dr. Kalen Cookson. He's the Director of Technical Research for Zoetis. His expertise is in vaccine programming and disease management. Currently, he focuses on applied research studies to improve vaccine effectiveness. He's got a DVM from NC State and a Master's of Avian Medicine from the University of Georgia. Please join me in welcoming our panelists today. Okay, the format that we'd like to follow today is that I've got some questions for the panelists, but certainly we want you to ask your questions. So if you do have a question, raise your hand and let us know. And we'll see if our panelists can give you an answer. As we all know, the USDA announced a proposed new Salmonella framework for ready-to-cook broiler products and for ground turkey. And then they had a comment period, which was extended till January 17th, so that is now expired. We don't know what's going to happen with this, and with the change of the administration, what impact that will have. But the bottom line is the reason the government decided that we need to rethink what we're doing with salmonella regulations is because after decades of the old framework, at least according to government statistics, they're attributing roughly the same number of human illnesses to salmonella coming from poultry products as we had before we started on this journey over 30 years ago. So, we're all, of course, our primary goal is to produce safe, wholesome food, for consumers. And so, it's really a joint effort, and it's in the industry's best, it's best for the industry to work for continuous improvement, and that's what we want to focus our discussion on today. We're not going to worry so much about, specifics in what's in the proposed framework, but rather focus on how do we move forward and, improve human illness or human health outcomes. All right, so we'll get rolling. Based on that, So I'll throw this out to the panelists. Based on your work with several broiler producers over the years to reduce the amount of salmonella on birds arriving at processing plants, what salmonella control strategies do you recommend? And this is pretty broad.
I agree. That's a broad question. Let me just first start by thanking all of you for being here. And I want to begin with I guess, a commendation to the poultry industry as a whole for the good work that has been done already in salmonella reduction. I know that we are faced with a proposed regulation, and there's probably going to be some variant of that that's likely to come out in sometime in the future. But I think it is important to also recognize that although some statistics say that salmonella illnesses may not necessarily have dropped, when you link those attributable to poultry to the increase in poultry volume that we've seen, I think the data can be debated on the performance of the industry. In fact, it can be stated, let me just say it, that the industry has actually on a per volume basis actually had reduction in salmonella illnesses attributable, as well as the known reduction of salmonella rates in the processing plants, which is public data. So anyway, I just wanted to start with that. But I'll just get the panel discussion going here and just say that in very broad terms, we're there as far as salmonella interventions being a pre-harvest plus processing endeavor. And for many decades, those of us in the room spent a lot of our time and energy and money on biomapping in the plant and reducing various contaminant loads from all the different processes in the plant, measuring indicator organisms, now measuring quantitative pathogen loads for salmonella and all of those things. But we're now at the point where to get to that next level of reduction, or shall I say, we're at a point of kind of diminishing returns. It really is truly a breeder, hatchery, broiler, turkey, farmer, integrator, veterinarian, nutritionist, food safety leader, processing plant manager, operations VP, even up to executive level requirement now to get to that next level of salmonella reduction. So I'll just kind of stop with that, and if any of the rest of the panel wants to talk about specific interventions, I know in pre-harvest we've got a bunch, and processing got a bunch, but I'll kind of kick it off with that.
Can I just throw a point out? I think the big piece over here is there's a lot of interventions, and in poultry we look at the hundreds of every cent, right? The real question is how much of it is actually effective in doing what. We don't really have a clear understanding, right? We have some understanding. I think vaccines probably better than others in really saying, if I stop looking at salmonella as one problem, like if you think about the world of cancer, we looked at cancer as one problem, right? But then we said, no, that's not true. We know that there are all of these serotypes. We know that there are a lot of different strains. We know the different vectors in which they come in are very different. So the clarity with which we understand where something is coming from and the very specific narrow response in saying which intervention is efficacious, that's not something that we know much about, right? So the reality of it is, if you try to fight cancer, that's a really tough battle to fight. I think we fought one really good battle, which is the use of peracetic acid inside the processing plant. But then along with that, we've also had to deal with yield issues, we've had to deal with OSHA issues, we've had to deal with a bunch of others. But outside of that blunt force instrument, I think that there's a real need to actually go back and say, which intervention, what is it capable of? Instead of talking about salmonella and loads, can we very specifically speak about which specific input vector and how much reduction or how much attenuation of the load or the specific serotype or the strain am I getting? I think that clarity will be important both for Allied, but also for the integrators and being able to evaluate each other about every 100th of a cent that you're adding to the cost.
That's a good point. I think, we kind of have to go back to basics again as well. In my view, salmonella is a flow-through organism coming from the very top of the production chain, and we really need to put prevention. We do a lot of products that will reduce or manage the infection, but the first thing we need to do is prevent the infection. And there are some new technologies that are back on the market, old technologies that are back, competitive exclusion products, vaccines, they're getting better. We probably need some more vaccine strains for specific SE and for live vaccines for other strains. But we've got to start at the very top. I mean, I think Richard Raymond, maybe, I don't know how long ago, he was Undersecretary for Food Safety, but he made the point, if you have people falling in the river upstream of a waterfall, it doesn't make much sense to focus on pulling them out at the bottom, right? It's the whole idea is to keep them from falling in the first place. So we really need to get back to that. I know our primary breeder companies do a very good job of producing a salmonella-free genetic stock, but I think we sometimes drop the ball when we get it into our breeder systems, especially pullet systems. We need to have insect control, rodent control, feed management, really try to keep those birds clean. We do not depopulate broiler breeder flocks in the United States, but they do in other countries. And if we have some very pathogenic strains, we may have to consider doing that. But ideally, we just try to do the best we can to keep them from getting infected in the first place. And if they are, once they become infected, we have to make a decision how best to control that infection so it doesn't continue to be propagated all through the production system, all the way down to the product going out the door of the plant.
Yeah, so to pick up on that, it starts from the top when we receive the parent stock chicks in any broiler operation. There's opportunities for Salmonella to come in and amplify anyway along that. And there's a long time, over a year, that those birds are in production and then they're passing on their progeny. And the truth of it, I think it's good to remember that we have all of these things that we need to control to try to limit the exposure of the Salmonella coming to the bird. But there's only one preventative strategy that builds the immunity specific to Salmonella within the bird and can start from the first day that they're hatched out, and that's vaccination. And it's specifically gives the birds that immune defense that helps that helps all of the other interventions that are trying to prevent the exposure and trying to limit that exposure. We cannot, the way we raise birds in this country, especially on used litter, we cannot, ever, hope that there will never be an exposure to Salmonella. It's inevitable. But if the birds have a good, solid baseline of immunity to start, and we continue to build on that on the breeder side, that's the fundamental. The pass-through is through the hatchery, but the more we can limit that exposure going into the hatchery, passing on the eggshell, passing through the egg, and the maternal antibodies we're passing to those broiler chicks is critical. Limiting the amount of infection that those broilers go through in those first few days when they're most susceptible is just fundamental to everything that we're trying to do.
Since we've started talking about vaccination, I had a question, in the framework, and sorry, I'm going to go back to that a little bit. Now the USDA has highlighted certain serovars of Salmonella, and my question is, do broiler and turkey producers have access to vaccines that are designed to protect breeders against all of the Salmonella serovars that are targeted in the proposed framework? And I know, Bill, you had a slide for us on that.
Yeah, just to kind of support what Kalen was saying there, I've done a lot of investigation into vaccines and their impact on specific serotypes of concern like typhimurium. And then, of course, the question always comes up is, what about cross protection? The integrators will typically ask, okay, so I give this vaccine, is it going to help me across other serotypes? And the good news is that the answer is to that is yes for many types of serotypes, not so much for others. But in this slide here, it's a good answer of why that is the case. I've got on this table here these serotypes of concern that were in the proposed rule, typhimurium, and then I4512I minus. Say that fast 5 times. I'll just call it monophasic typhimurium from henceforth in chicken, chicken carcasses, parts, and ground chicken, and then enteritidis in chicken, and then in turkeys, we see typhimurium as well as Hadar and Munchin. But if you look at the serogroup Bs there, and look at that column of the somatic or the O antigens, you can see some shared somatic antigens between typhimurium and monophasic typhimurium. And then over on the enteritidis, you can see some shared somatic antigens there. So scientifically, it would make sense that you see some cross protection across those serotypes. Now, the question is, what about typhimurium and its impact on the turkey, Hadar, Munchin, and others that are in the group C? I mean, I would say that researchers are looking hard at that. I know there is some analysis done by USDA ARS, for example. I believe it's out of Ames, where they looked in the Zika and actually did find some cross protection there, but maybe not as much. But it can be seen from time to time across other serotypes. But definitely, those where like a typhimurium vaccine is administered, you do see cross protection, at least in those that have similar antigen factors.
I'd like to forward this discussion to the cross protection discussion. The killed SE vaccines are commercially available. And they've been available and very effective against controlling and limiting SE, especially in the layer industry, for over 20 years now. But we've done work, and you can see why you could entertain that there could be cross protection between an SE bacterin and Group B Salmonella, and we have demonstrated that. We have seen that. It's clearly, at least in bird challenge controlled studies, we see solid cross protection against Group Bs. We've done Heidelberg. So it's very clear that the shared somatic antigens can make a difference from a killed standpoint. And we've recognized that the killed vaccines, bacterins, don't tend to cross protect as well as lives. And so we do not see that same level of cross protection when we get into say a Group C challenge. But with the live vaccines, even though it's a different type of immunity that we're getting with live vaccines and killed vaccines, we are able to see more hints at cross protection, even against Group Cs. And it's interesting, Hadar is on here. We've seen even cross protection, not on the same level that an ST would show against an SE or another Group B challenge, but even against a Hadar, we've seen cross protection, at least on internal organs. And if you look at that chart, there are no shared antigens that are seen there. So there are other factors, cell-mediated immunity, that's important, that live vaccines afford another opportunity for a different type of immune response. So there is hope that, if we implement the vaccines that we have today and use them as effectively and as consistently as possible, we can really help ourselves, even against the Group Cs. Infantis is a big one nowadays, and we've actually even seen that in some field trials where we see more of an effect against Group Bs, but we're still seeing an effect against Group Cs. You probably
I've seen the same thing, and I think a lot of it has to do, look out there on those flagellar phase 2 antigens. You see there's some conserved same antigen factors 1 across typhimurium as well as Munchin down there, and if you had Infantis up there, you'd see that same antigen factor 1 in Infantis. So it makes some sense scientifically that there could be some cross protection, not as much as you would see given a Group B vaccine to protecting against other Group Bs, and maybe Ds, but it is showing up there. And I think we need to research it further.
Can I add a couple of things? Can you go back a couple of slides, Terrence, which I think it's not vaccine related. Let's say on the next one, the next slide, please. One over here. So a couple of things, right? So if you think about this away from the technical point about why the companies are spending money on salmonella control, especially at the breeder level, a lot of this is they're expecting a certain barrier to exist, right? So the word effectively was used, right? And basically saying, if I effectively vaccinate 1 million birds, not 1 million birds, so a smaller number because you're talking about breeder vaccination. The question is how many of those birds actually, even though they're homologous, how many of them actually build that immunity is always a question, right? So there's one source of multivariate challenge, which has nothing to do with the vaccine, but with how administration works. And the second piece, if you look at a lot of the data that's generated, it's at these challenge trials, right? Where you have some ATCC strain or University of Arkansas strain, which is really, really well characterized. You go into the real world, it's a little bit of the Wild West, right? You have multiple serotypes, and there's a publication on modern poultry that very specifically speaks about how even within Enteritis or Typhimurium, for that example, different strains within the same serotype can have varying lag times and varying doubling times, right? And that's one metric to measure. So you really have to ask yourself the question about, is this at the right dosage? Is there a double dose that's necessary? Is there an augmentation with something else that's necessary? So I think, like, to check the box, Terrence, I think we have vaccines, but in terms of actually the intended effect of saying if the intended effect is the vaccine should stonewall anything that is coming in over there, I think that there's just too many holes. And the question is saying, are there ways in which companies that are developing the vaccines, can they have better tools to basically say, you know what, I want to know, instead of a qualitative response of some cross protection, saying 80% of all wild type strains that we've seen, we know we've found them to be efficacious. The rest of you that are out there purchasing, you go, you know what, that's like the weather. If there's an 80% chance, I'm going to take an umbrella, right? But if it's a 20% chance, you know what, I'm going to wing it, right? So I think it's a multivariate problem, but it definitely checks the box that we have vaccines. But hopefully there's augmentations either through other products or through more incremental improvement of the vaccines or through better management that can hopefully make it into a better wall than what we have today.
We've actually done a lot of work in the past, probably 3 years, maybe 4 years, looking at ways that we can get more out of the products that we currently have available, because, no telling how much time it will take before we get more fundamentally different vaccines. So what we've done is actually looked at combining live vaccine, actually mixing it with the killed SE bacterin, and we're seeing a much greater immune response to the live vaccine. And we've looked at it either injected separately. I just think the access to the immune system is just that much greater. And we see an enhanced immune response. You can actually measure it in ELISA titers, which I think breeder companies should use the ELISA test kits that we have available. We do that for infectious IBDV. We check for our IBD titers, our Rio titers in our breeder flock to see that we're making sure that the vaccines are being applied, they're being primed properly, we have expectations. We can do that for Salmonella, and I don't think we're doing enough of that. It's about passing the highest levels of protection we can to the progeny, giving them that passive immunity in that first critical 7 to 10 days. And so we've seen you get a tremendously enhanced response by injection, but what we also saw is when it's mixed with the kill vaccine, you get an even greater response, probably because of the adjuvant, interaction with the ST antigen you're adding into the mix. So that's one example of, getting more out of what we have until we get other fundamentally different products that we can introduce also to the whole formulation.
I'd like to add to that too, Kalen. We've got a competitive exclusion product back on the market. It was introduced in the early 2000s, late 90s. It was pulled off the market back then, and it is applied to at day of age. And the objective is to sort of coat the intestinal tract to block the attachment of Salmonella and other pathogens. And that, there's data showing that's very synergistic with the live vaccines. So it's kind of a two-pronged approach. One is to sort of block attachment, the other is to stimulate that immune response. And between the two of them, it potentiates both products. So I highly recommend people take a look at that as well. Try to get more bang for the buck, so to speak, by kind of getting these products that work together and don't fight with each other, to see if we can just enhance the protection from infection in the first place.
And so that's day of age in breeders then?
It can be day of age in all ages. Sorry, dropped my water. Breeders and broilers as well, and turkeys. So any bird, that's hatched at day of age probably would benefit from that protection.
Arjun, earlier you mentioned cancer and, control of cancer in relation to dealing with the Salmonella problem. And I've been thinking about that in terms of, you're not going to be successful curing cancer if you treat it as one thing. You have to know what kind of cancer someone has and then work on the specifics of treating and curing that. And so we're dealing with a similar situation with Salmonella because we have different serotypes that can be introduced in different places in the supply chain, correct? And so I think that tees up the question on how do we know what we have and where it is?
Yeah, no, I think I'm talking my book here, but I think one of the really interesting technologies that came out was out of Dr. Nikki Shariat's lab. Some of you may be aware. She developed this way to look at mixed serotypes of Salmonella within an enrichment, right? So today, if you look at it, one of the big challenges is Salmonella grows very differently, right? So if somebody has both lung cancer and pancreatic cancer, and the only thing that you can actually, this is a terrible example, but I'll just continue with the analogy. If you just say, you know what, all you see is only lung cancer, don't worry about it, right? My gosh, what a terrible mistake, right? So similarly over here, the fundamental methodologies around using how we serotype, we look for the most abundant ones because the fastest serotype always outbeats everything else. And then from a colony picking standpoint, again, you're looking at ones where math always wins, right? So when you could pick 5 colonies or all that you want. Math will win every single time, right? So she showed this technology almost 10 years ago. If you go to the previous slide, I'd like to share a little bit of real world data that we actually saw. One thing over here is, sorry, actually 2 slides over on the other side. Wow. So the thing, super, thank you. So one of the big things that we really went out there was there isn't a lot of data about what's seen in the real world in terms of serotypes. So people go, you know what, all I see is Kentucky, right? How many times has everyone said, in the live side I see Kentucky, but on the plant side all I see is Infantis, right? There's got to be some sort of a meaningful resolution for it. And so what we started doing was we applied this ability to look at deep serotypes, so mixed serotypes, and we said we're going to go out and do that at breeders, we're going to do that at broilers, we're going to do that at day-old pullets, we're going to do that at week of slaughter. And we really started seeing that in a lot of these cases, a lot of the serotypes were hidden inside, right? So while Kentucky, which basically doubles, if you go back a couple of slides, Terrence, one more, over here, if you look at Kentucky, Kentucky basically doubles approximately every 19 minutes, okay? And on the live side, there's no pressures. It has a live host, and it's a great condition, versus you look at something like Enteritis, it doubles every 26 minutes, right? So the reality of it is you can pick up a sample. The minute you enrich for 4 hours, math takes over, right? You're not going to see any Enteritis. You're going to falsely believe that there's only Kentucky. Whereas you go to the next slide over here, you go in the processing plant, why do I not see Kentucky? Well, peracetic acid, we just took 312 parts per million. This is actually dwell times, right? I'm not like running it and then taking the sample out. I'm actually letting the different Salmonella serotypes sit in the peracetic acid. What's really interesting, and these are all the exact same OD600, right? You're talking about the same loads that are going in. The reality of it is some of these serotypes, namely Kentucky, gets wiped by PAA, even at 312 parts per million. But then you look at something like Infantis, in peracetic acid, in about 4 hours' time, it tends to start doubling, right? It required much higher loads, and that's not all strains of Infantis, right? We have a detailed study that we published. But the reality of it is knowing the serotype, using the existing tools is one part of it, but knowing all the serotypes, so being able to assess, if I'm looking at a vaccine, saying, you know what, there's always going to be risk. While I trust the primary breeders, they still have to put out millions of birds every week. There's going to be a small percentage that might eke through. If you go into the breeders, I might get the best protection. There's going to be a small percentage that ekes through. If you keep multiplying those percentages, that still becomes a massive number and still becomes a food safety risk. But if you know what, actually, yeah, Kentucky's there, but I've got that covered in the plant. I don't need to worry about Kentucky. But what I really need to worry about is my typhimurium, and I better have a really, really robust typhimurium vaccination program. So one part of uncovering the detail and then saying my prevention strategy or my intervention strategy is going to be a sniper attack against that versus just a sledgehammer where I'm going to hope and pray that it works.
So we've talked about on the breeder farm, and when we get the birds on the growing farm, I did have some questions regarding, so what role does general intestinal health play in salmonella control once the birds are on the growing farm?
I can start out with that. I think work was done a number of years ago looking at the impact of feed withdrawal on intestinal integrity. And one of the correlations to that is that when you either have too short of a feed withdrawal prior to processing on the farm, you end up with too much feed, right? That gets cross-contaminates in the plant. But the other end of it is, and this is just an example, when there's excessive feed withdrawal, the intestinal tract becomes very thin and friable and breaks easily. And that has already been correlated with increased salmonella contamination of the product. And if you think about it, the gut is the number one barrier, right? It's the largest immune system organ that we have in the body, and it's the barrier for keep the outside world out and from the inside world, away from the inside world. So gut health, fortunately, we're making a lot of headway trying to understand what's happening in that very complex environment, the number of and types of different bacteria that are living there. Like we've got a lot more better tools with microbiome analysis, and we can see shifts in the microbiome when we feed different feed additive products that target that intestinal population, that ecosystem. So it's pretty obvious that plays a big role in trying to keep birds from being infected, from controlling the infection if they are infected with salmonella, and also to keep that contamination from becoming contaminating the finished meat product during processing.
Yeah, coccidia control is crucial to any intestinal health, sound intestinal health program, not just for performance, but also to keep the gut intact, avoid leaky gut type situation. We did a study a few years ago where we basically took our necrotic enteritis model, which is cocci followed by Clostridium for a couple, 3 days, and we overlaid a salmonella exposure into that, and we saw there's clearly, when you didn't have control of the cocci and the necrotic enteritis, that you had a bloom of the salmonella that they were either exposed to prior to the clostridial challenge or at the same time. So that's extremely important to have, and also along with gut control is litter control, and they kind of go hand in hand. If you have leaky gut, you're going to have wetter litter. Wet litter is going to be more conducive to bacterial blooms that then the birds will pick back up fecal oral. So it all plays together.
The diversity of the conditions are really important, right? There's some established studies of what Beth just said in saying, withdrawal time is important. The other part over here is what is my cocci cycling? Like if I'm having selenomycin resistance in one farm, does that farm actually indicate all the risk that I have? we don't know those sorts of questions, the answers, right? So there's two questions, the question that you asked, Terrence, there's obviously visceral salmonella that have nothing to do with the intestinal tract, right? So that's a separate question. But in terms of getting the gut health off to a good start, I mean, chicken are little engines that convert protein, that convert soybean and corn into protein, right? That's what they are. So that's the power engine that we really have. So keeping that really fine-tuned is really important. But when you have 60 farms or you're slaughtering 20 farms a week, right? The reality of it is each of those 20 farms are not identical. You may be running the same controller, but the eggs that you got on one farm from a breeder may have enteritis. The litter on that same farm may be pretty poor, and that same farm may actually have improper cocci vaccination, right? So while it's 1 million birds that I'm slaughtering every single week, the reality of it is actually I need to have immense understanding because I've spent the best dollars on the best programs, but the reality of it, I need to treat by exceptions, right? I've got a control program in place, but I need to know the 3 farms that need hypercare, and I need to do something else, and that may be something like changing the withdrawal time or giving it more downtime because the litter's pretty poor, or putting alum on the litter. Like, it could be something, right? But it's something that needs to be a little bit more of a rescue to really get the farm's immunity, right? It's not just the bird's immunity. A big part of it is also making sure that the farm is conducive enough. And I think that visibility for the gut and how that interplays is just super interesting.
I think there's another underlying kind of dynamic that people don't talk about a whole lot. If you look at, and that's the impact of the immune system to be able to keep salmonella under control. If you look at human salmonellosis cases, the demographics of it, the vast majority are in children under the age of 5 and in the elderly. And that's the 2 immunocompromised groups. With poultry, birds are very susceptible to salmonella in their very young age, maybe the 5 to 7, 10-day window. Once birds become mature, the salmonella is really put under house arrest, so to speak. They may still be infected, but they're not actively shedding. They're able to sequester the salmonella infection with a mature immune response. What we often we see, especially with enteritis, is that when breeder birds that are infected come into peak production, they'll shed SE like crazy into chicks. So that indicates that stress response is the bird is stressed coming into peak production, and that sort of break on the salmonella replication is taken off because the bird's stressed with everything else. And that is the same thing when they have intestinal problems, have cocci. They're very stressed, and that allows that salmonella to really overgrow and be released from the regulatory pressure that keeps it from replicating. And we can keep that in mind. So all the stresses added to birds also create an environment for salmonella to really take off and grow to unacceptable levels.
Now, we're always going to have feed withdrawal. So are there any other best practices for feed withdrawal, and then whether or not we treat the water while the birds are going through withdrawal, or what would you recommend?
I think that's been a recommendation for a number of years, to acidify the drinking water. Birds should be kept on water during feed withdrawal, so they're not as likely to be pecking at the litter. We want to get the guts cleared as much as possible before they go to the processing plant. Of course, process them within the ideal window, but acidified water or treated water has been proven to be helpful in the past. I'm not sure how widely it's still used, though.
A couple of things that we've seen in the real world is really the question about, do you run something that's mild, right, without going into any specific products, or do you have something that's more like an organic acid that you actually need to run? I think that one is obviously, the problem is salmonella sits with a cost where the benefit cannot be measured, right, which is just a tough thing in a world where we're counting down the hundreds of cents. So the question, everybody seems to be doing something, but there's a couple of things that we've seen, like tried and tested technologies, but the industry still is not potentially looking at, looking at litter amendments. There are a couple of companies that have the ability to do litter amendments the week before, right, while the birds are still inside. and there's meaningful reduction, right? But that as a modality of actually taking an existing intervention that we have and saying, you know what, I'm going to go in and I'm actually going to be doing it requires working between the integrator, between live production and the allied, and saying that can give me better control because it doesn't actually affect the water, but at the same time, my liver by itself is improved. So I think that there's the tried ones, there's some skepticism about, am I getting my money's worth, right? Or should I be running organic acid, which is really expensive if you actually start running it at every house. So there's some skepticism around that. And then there's a question about, are there tools that I'm already using in a different way before the birds come in, but if there's a way to meaningfully administer them during, or can I modulate the downtime? Sorry, not the downtime, can I modulate the withdrawal window? There's 2 withdrawal windows, right? High-risk farms, can I actually go to the second withdrawal window instead of the first withdrawal window? So I think those sorts of questions which we're seeing customers ask us on a day-to-day basis.
Can I kind of chase that rabbit a little bit? I mean, I think what we're kind of morphing into this discussion around is just kind of the whole pre-harvest food safety intervention. What are our thoughts around all of those? Of course, we camped out on vaccine, and I think we've hopefully all made it clear. Monitoring to some degree is important. I think a combination of serotype analysis as well as some quantitative loads makes a lot of sense in my mind. This gives you valuable data. But I guess the one thing I would encourage everybody to do is ask your technical vendor experts to come help you. You know, we've not talked about, for example, darkling beetles, but we got people in this room right now that they spend a lot of their time working on reducing darkling beetles, which we know is a vector for salmonella. You can measure those indirectly, or the beetle loads at the houses, or you can actually do microbiological monitoring on those types of things as well. Ask somebody to come in that's an expert on litter management, particularly like windrowing. I mean, windrowing is wonderful if your company's committed to it. It's not good at all if your farmer's not committed to it, right? You can almost make it worse if windrowing is not done exactly right, where you get a good kill process into there. So, the total pre-harvest blocking and tackling cannot be stressed enough, and asking questions, engaging vendors, and that in conjunction with using science and validated trials at your own operation, whether it's a probiotic, a prebiotic, a vaccine, maybe a litter amendment, and look at the salmonella loads several ways. Quantitatively, I like that. Also, some periodic measure of serotypes.
So I did have one question that came up, and I'm not sure if you know the answers. So broiler slaughter plants that participated in the hemp program were allowed a line speed waiver and could operate evisceration lines up to 175 birds per minute. To maintain this line speed waiver, plants were later required to participate in the Salmonella Initiative program. What's the current status of the line speed waivers, and how might the new Salmonella framework impact it?
I'll take that one. Okay. And I was just catching up with some of the food safety leaders in the room before the meeting to kind of get the latest on this, because it's sort of this whole regulatory world is sort of, we're watching it week by week, right? Without getting into too much of the past, the hemp plants, HACCP inspection model plants, converted over the years to the new poultry inspection system processes. And then some, I believe 160 or so plants now between broilers and turkeys are up onto that program. I believe has been a very successful conversion. There's a fraction of those, I think 20-30% of those facilities that signed up for the for the safety study, and that study has gone on for some period of time. It's my understanding that study has been extended, and line speed waivers are at the current moment still in place for those that have them. But the study that FSIS and OSHA, I believe, wanted to do to evaluate the long-term application of maybe potentially permanent line speed waivers. I believe that is still being assessed.
I guess one ask over here, right? So with the new administration, I think that there is an opportunity to ask, right? Fundamentally, line speed waivers are good business in that operational efficiency of plants go up by 25%, right? It's money back in the pocket, and that is money that can potentially be utilized through better salmonella control in this day and age where you can see things in the live side and you have better tools. I think if there's value with a unified voice between food safety people, plant people, as well as the companies themselves to actually ask for that, because that's really how we make the U.S. more competitive, right? There's countries that don't have that limit, and the reality of it is there's more sense in that are back. Those can go towards better interventions, better control. So I think while we're guessing, there's a real opportunity to actually have a louder voice and saying, actually, this is what we want, because this is an industry that has been conservative and not asking for it. I think basically saying this is needed can make a huge difference.
I think the combination of faster line speeds in those select plants, as well as the movement toward more pasture-raised birds without antibiotics. There's been a lot of things that I think the public and maybe regulators have believed would cause food safety to go the wrong way, and that's not been the case. Food safety and salmonella reduction has continued in the industry, so as long as we can prove that our processes are meeting food safety objectives or maybe making improvements, yeah, I agree with Arjun. We should continue to ask for those.
So we've talked a lot about what companies should be doing. I haven't worked in a plant in over 30 years, and way back when I did, we didn't test every flock that came in for salmonella. Is that commonplace now that you test every flock? Are we just testing some flocks?
I think it's mixed in the industry. There are some integrators that, yeah, are doing a mixture of quantitative loads, maybe some boot socks at the farm or something, pretty regular. There are some that do that, I believe, on a sporadic basis, that kind of do it as part of a snapshot look at their complex periodically. Going forward, how can we develop those kind of routine, ongoing, and again, I've said quantitative load, I'll say it one more time, kind of quantitative load measures either pre-harvest and or just at the early part of the entrance to the birds at the plant. How we can optimize those, I think, will be important going forward on a voluntary basis. I don't believe it needs to be mandated by the government. But I think it's mixed, Terrence, at this time, and it just kind of depends on the needs of the complex.
Yeah, if I can just pony up on that, I think a couple of things that Bill said. So first of all, I agree on the quantification piece. I disagree with anything that's not math-based, right? So a big part of my caveat is when you have something like MPN that corrects for lag and growth rate problems all day, right? Being able to get non-enrichment based or mathematically accurate ways of quantification is incredibly valuable. I think one of the big reasons to why we're seeing this huge difference is bimodal, right? So you've got a bunch of companies that are doing a lot, and you've got companies that basically go, why should I? I actually will side more with the companies that are going, why should I? Because they're asking a tough question, because a lot of this data is collected, and then what do you do with it, right? It's good quality practice, but the unfortunate reality of it is something that was said previously, I forget who it was, I think it was Bill, about asking your technical lead that's coming in from a Zoetis or whichever company and saying, hey, I don't want to do monitoring just for the heck of doing monitoring. I want to know what my profile is changing and the efficacy very, very specifically about what's happening, right? Because that feedback loop or that loop of saying, hey, live production, I have something live that's coming in. We've spoken about logistical slaughter for a long time, but we're not talking about downtime management. We're not talking about withdrawal management. Even logistical slaughter, a lot of people don't effectively do it because it requires orchestration. And so it's almost like dead dollars that are sitting there, right? So if the minute you actually tie it to these use cases of saying, I'm going to either put more money back in my pocket or I'm going to I'm going to get more juice out of this effective vaccine or probiotic or whatever it is that is there, I think then the quantitative data and the serotype contextualized with what you're doing when you're doing it, I think if we see that, I think almost everybody will voluntarily do it because it's a no-brainer then. But right now it's pretty bimodal.
Let me just say one more thing about, I'm following you there and agree with a lot of what you're saying there, Arjun. Quantitatively, farms are different. Write it down. Farms are different. They're different. And if you, over time, you can find, if you do enough quantitative measures, whether it's through an MPN or through some rapid method. Granted, some of those have, they're more general in nature as far as the quantitative value you get, but they're a good indicator tool, qPCR. But you'll find out farms, you'll find the hot farms, you'll find the ones that are high because they stay high over time, and consequently you also find those that are best performers. So what that allows you to do then is go see what's going on at the best performer farms, and then try to do farm checks at those that are not, and adjust accordingly. Similarly, on serotype analysis, over time, it seems like the serotypes at particular complexes stay the same. Particular operations stay the same, and they're different in different complexes, even within the same state. So it's an over time. It's a long answer, Terrence, but this is pre-harvest monitoring is a over time, continuous improvement type of an approach to monitoring that takes a while to kind of assess where you are.
And I'd just like to add that I think we do a lot of monitoring, but the question is, so what? So just like on the plant side, monitoring is not a corrective action, right? Monitoring is a tool, but something needs to be done. So using it to validate your interventions on the live side is probably the most appropriate use of monitoring.
My only thing is don't look at monitoring as a separate thing, right? To the point, it's the accuracy of the data. If the data is accurate and if you are satisfied, that's the bias that you carry, right? And that's okay. My suggestion is best-in-class tools, which have fewer error rates. Second, again, not endorsing any specific method. Second one is why, right? It's the very specific action about efficacy or incoming risk to change the specific farm's profile through some practice. And I think if we as an industry can figure out how to get there faster and faster, I think the more the wins can actually be there had.
We've been talking a lot. Does anyone in the audience have a question for us before we wrap up?
One of the questions that I get asked is, under the proposed rule, especially at the line speeds at 175, and if you're doing your sampling like you should be, and you pop one of those top 3 serotypes, what are the consequences of your line speed going to be in the future? Do we know that yet?
I think that's still yet to be determined, with the proposed rule on halt right now. Is the fact that you got one potentially that's above the 10 or above in the proposed rule and one of these serotypes of concern, does that mean some immediate action? I would hope not. I mean, I would think that there would be some reasonable process of taking more samples and maybe making process adjustments, but I think it's yet to be seen.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
I need about an hour. I have enough questions for you. The vaccines, we were going to the vaccines. Why do vaccines work when we're given to the muscle and we're trying to when we're sampling the gastrointestinal tract? And maybe we need to look more into the actual muscle, the body itself, as opposed to just looking at the gastrointestinal tract, looking at the carcass rinses or the cecal contents. One of the things on my research that I found was the salmonellas don't go to the same place, and that it could go within the individual serovars or the different serovars. And one of the studies we found out was that Salmonella in Heidelberg was going all over the body. I could find it in the blood, I could find it in the joints. And how is that vaccine going to help the gut and that aspect of it, but it definitely will help in the individual muscle types. Feed withdrawal. We tend to give acidify the drinking water all the time. Most companies not going on to hear this. I believe that when you do during the feed withdrawal, that you acidify the drinking water, that you don't give it to the entire life of the animal. You need to shock the salmonella, so that you come in there and during that feed withdrawal period, you would acidify the drinking water. Why do we acidify the drinking water? When we take the feed away from the birds, we're also taking feed away from the bacteria. The number one bacteria in the crop of that bird is lactobacillus. Lactobacillus numbers drop. That's why lactic acid goes down and the pH increases. Going back to feed withdrawal, when they're doing the feed withdrawal, birds are programmed to eat. And we take the feed away, they start looking for other things to eat. There's a 4-fold increase of them grazing on that litter when they do that feed withdrawal. The birds themselves peck at contrast, so that if there is something dark on the litter and it's a light litter, they're going to gobble it up. If it's a white feather that happens to have fecal contents on it, they're going to gobble it up on the dark litter. Let's see what else I had. Coxy. On the Coxy control programs, why is Coxy cause salmonella to increase? When you actually look at the cellular level of the enterocytes, Coxy invades and causes new enterocytes to be produced. New enterocytes go through gluconeogenesis and they produce glucose. Salmonella likes to gobble up that glucose, and it also explains why our necrotic enteritis tends to bloom as well. Is they get a lot of glucose being present there on a young thing. It also produces an oxygen environment in that small area. Let's see what else I've missed. Going back to feed withdrawal itself, when we do interventions, we need to look at the how those interventions are occurring on the farm. That feed withdrawal is dramatically important, and sometimes we tend to ignore how those feed withdrawals go, and we'll tend to go along on those and explain why does it go up. During a normal feed withdrawal period, we tend to see a doubling in Campylobacter and a 5-fold increase in Salmonella. So please pay attention to the feed withdrawal period. I'm going to stop and let other people ask questions.
Well, to the question about the intramuscular delivery, for example, of a live Salmonella ST, I just feel like you're just delivering that entire dose, which with the live vaccines, we're talking, over 1 million organisms per dose. It's getting full access to the systemic system of the bird, where full immunity response of the white blood cells can be awakened. Whereas if you're administering it by spray, how much of that vaccine actually makes it into the bird, absorbed through the mucosal surfaces and goes into the GI tract? So you're not getting any directly into the GI tract, but we're clearly measuring immunity from our oral challenges, by looking at the incidence and the loads in the GI tract after challenge. So it's clearly, the immune response is getting there. Your white blood cells are also, they're communicating with the GI tract. So, we know different mucosal surfaces all interconnect and communicate with each other. But I think it's just the sheer numbers of the vaccine by injecting versus an oral or a spray administration is the game changer there, especially if it's mixed with the kill vaccine and it's got that adjuvanted response and the depot effect, persistence in the tissue. I don't think the live vaccine stays persistent viable, but there's probably some parts of the antigen that are still present, in the tissue site. We did one study. It was at a poster at the IPSF meeting. We did an infantis challenge, and we saw over 20,000 CFUs of the infantis in the Zika 7, 8 days after the challenge, and the kill plus the live given together, that was down below 10. So it was a 3 log reduction in the intestinal tract. So it's measurable. So
I think a corollary to that is that the immune system is everywhere
Yeah.
in the body. So wherever you have a foreign
Right.
entity detected, the immune system is going to be activated, and it picks up those antigens and drags them off to the spleen and liver and to process them and produce antibodies, et cetera. So we've got multiple portals of entry, and the immune system is everywhere, literally. Sort of like government surveillance.
No, I think that there's something very interesting that you brought up, right? What you're talking about is not allied research. You're talking about translational research that we do so well on the clinical side. But really, everything that we just quoted here are pen trials and challenge trials. None of those are real, right? The reality of the things that you have seen in either in vitro or in vivo early trials or from a scientific review, the idea is how can the head veterinarians, the head of FSQA, actually go from a translational basis, can I do meaningful controlled assessments of the very specific question? Can we put it to bed, right? Because the reality of it is for the last 10 years that I've been in the industry, we ask these questions, but we've generated so much data at this point in time where some of these clearly don't do anything, right? And some of these clearly win in very specific ways. Otherwise, we would not have the government just, at least the SPAS administration bringing the back of the neck of the industry saying, you need to get better. The reality of it is we need to take certain things and go, not working. We need to take certain things and go, in this current paradigm, applied differently at scale in a real world setting, it is efficacious against A, B, and C. I think having that information through an academic industry partnership, not through the lenses of an allied company, I think is immensely valuable.
Okay, I think we've just about used our time. Before we leave, once again, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Ancera, Boehringer Ingelheim, the Poultry Federation, and Zoetis. And please join me in thanking our panelists today. And thank you for joining us this morning, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of the show.